Today, I'm going to show you a simple way to organize your thinking so you can calculate better than 99% of your opponents. Because at the end of the day, calculation is the number one skill for any chess player. The first position is already up on the screen, and my opponent plays queen to b5, which is a serious blunder. But why does this move lose, and what do we do now? Well, this is the moment to calculate, and the most important thing here is that you calculate your own moves and your opponent's moves too. Now, I'm going to walk you through this step by step so you can get your thinking organized. And the first thing when you look at a position is to do what we call analysis of the position, which basically means spotting the tactical themes that are sitting right there. Now, these tactical themes are stuff like the mating theme, the discovered attack, the deflection, the pin, and the fork. And since there's a whole bunch of them, after queen to b5, it's worth stopping for a second and asking yourself what tactical themes are living in this position and what you're going to go after here. So before you start calculating in your lines, what you really need to do is recognize the tactical patterns that are already on the board. And it's kind of like running a sweep where you scan the board and ask yourself where the hidden possibilities are hiding. For example, there's already a mating idea showing up here, because all you gotta do is combine the pawn on f3 with the queen on h3 with mate ideas on g2, and just like that, the threat is set. For now, the opponent still has a defense, but we go ahead and file that pattern away mentally, because it can come back and work a few moves down the line. Now, another important detail is the back rank, and to get why, just imagine that h2 square isn't available, because in that case, a simple rook to d1 with check can turn into immediate mate. So that's one more mating theme we've got to keep on file. Other than those two, nothing else really stands out for now, because there aren't any pieces just hanging out there completely loose on the board. Even though the bishop on c1 is hanging, it's worth asking whether there's something even more promising than taking that bishop. Now here's the thing. Everything points to the main elements of this position revolving around the mating ideas, and those are exactly what should guide your next calculations. So once you've spotted the tactical themes, the second step comes in, which is turning those ideas into candidate moves. And this is where you start picking which moves are actually worth calculating. And why does this matter so much? Because unlike a chess engine, a human just can't calculate every single move in the position. So the smart move is to pick a few, 2, 3, 4 at most, and work off of those. And keep in mind that at this stage, you're not really calculating yet. You're just organizing your thinking. Now the secret is to start with the most forcing moves, the ones where your opponent's response is pretty much forced. And here, queen to h3 and rook to d1 with check jump right out at you. So if you go with rook d1, the opponent doesn't have much of a choice because he's got to play king to h2. And if he tries anything else, like pulling the queen back, he just loses on the spot. And that's exactly the beauty of prioritizing forcing moves, because the calculation gets way simpler when you already know how the other side is going to react. So we've reached a point where we've got two moves in line, which are rook d1 with check and queen on h3. And the question now is which one to start with. And the trick is understanding that not all moves carry the same weight, because some of them basically force the opponent to react in one single way, and that makes your life so much easier when it's time to calculate. The best example of this is the check, because whenever you give check, there's no way for your opponent to ignore it, since he's forced to respond right away. And right after that come the captures, because when you take a piece, in the vast majority of cases, the opponent has to take back, so that also makes the sequence easy to predict. Then you've got the mate threats, because if you play queen to h3, you create a direct mate threat on g2, and the other side just can't let that slide, so they've got to respond immediately. And finally, there's the attack on hanging pieces, because when you put pressure on a loose piece, it's usually going to have to be defended or moved out of there. So these four types of move, the check, the take, the mate threat, and the attack on the piece, are the ones that restrict your opponent's options the most. And that's exactly why they're the best starting points when you begin calculating a position. I know exactly what you might be thinking when you hear analysis of the position, candidate moves, and forcing moves, which is something like, this seems way too slow. I'm never going to have time for this in a real game. But don't worry, because I thought it felt slow at first too. And it's the same thing my think ahead students feel in the first few days, since everybody finds this step by step a little weird at the start, but then it becomes automatic. Now, think of it as training for your mind, because it's just like learning to drive, where at first you're thinking about every pedal, the gear shift, and the rear view mirror, but then it all becomes automatic. And in chess, exactly the same thing happens. So the goal isn't to keep repeating step 1, step 2 forever. It's to train your brain to think the right way. Because with practice, you take one look at the position and your brain runs that sweep of themes and candidate moves almost without noticing. So what's a checklist today becomes intuition tomorrow. And here's the golden tip, which goes like this. When you sit down to solve exercises, write the step-by-step down on paper because that really helps lock in the process. Now it's time to actually put the calculation into action because up to this point, we've only organized ideas and candidates, but now we're going to see how this works in practice. So when you're looking for where to start, always give priority to the move that creates a check. And in this case, the most direct move is rook to d1 with check. Now, it's no good just looking at your own move and stopping there, because real calculation also means seeing your opponent's response. And if you skip that part, you end up playing on autopilot, which is exactly how most people go wrong. So here we go. After rook to d1 with check, what happens? White has no choice because the king has to go to h2, and that response is forced. And this is the point where you keep digging into the position, because once the king has gone to h2, you've got to ask yourself whether there's another check available or some hidden mating pattern. So that's why you should always go back and look for the forcing moves, since those are the ones that guide the analysis and make the calculation so much simpler. Now, in the actual game, I played exactly this move, rook to d1 with check, which was the strongest here, and the king was forced back to h2. And now there's a sequence that leads straight to an unavoidable mate. So if you are, pause the video and try to find the combination, because after king to h2, the decisive idea would come in, which is rook to h1 with check. Now, this sack looks bold at first glance, but in practice, it leaves white no way out, since every response is forced. And that's exactly why the position falls apart in just a few moves. And this is the kind of situation where you see how recognizing the theme and starting with the most forcing move simplifies the choice, because once you see the pattern, the decision becomes obvious. So if white tries to hang on with king to h1, the sequence is already decided, because queen to h3 with check comes in, then king to g1, and right after that, queen to g2 mate, all forced. And the mate comes precisely from the coordination between the pawn on f3 and the queen on h3. And even the other line after queen to b5 doesn't save the opponent either, because if you go with queen to h3, of course, in this example, rook d1 wins because we give a check and we pick up the bishop. But imagine that bishop isn't here, right? Because this example is pretty simple, and it's really just here to introduce you to how to think. And I know a lot of people in the comments zeroed in on the bishop and didn't spot the maiden theme right away. But anyway. The only defense he's got is queen to f1. Now, at first glance, it looks like that solves it, but you just keep going with rook to d1, and if he still tries the resource of rook takes on b8 with check, you simply play king to h7. So even then, the position is still lost for white, since any take on d1 leads to mate on g2, and the threat is always there. So in the end, both rook to d1 and queen to h3 lead to the win. And the difference is that the line with the rook is shorter, while the other one forces the opponent to drag the loss out for a few more moves. Let's take a look at a new example so we can put this calculation method into practice one more time. And in this position, my opponent played rook to b3, pinning my bishop on b5, which is exactly the kind of situation where you can't just play on autopilot, because it's time to stop and calculate calmly. Now, the idea here is for you to repeat the same process we used in the first example, which means analyze the tactical themes showing up on the board, turn that into concrete options, and from there, pick your candidate moves. So the method stays the same. It's just applied to a different position now, precisely so you can see how it works in any scenario. So just to recap, the first step is to do the analysis of the position, understanding the tactical themes of that moment. And since he played rook to b3 and pinned my bishop on b5, I want you to look at the position and see what's screaming out at you there. Now, one of the tactical themes is that he's got a knight on a4 defending, and a piece that's defending is always a tactical theme. So whenever you see a piece defending, you keep an eye on it. Another theme is that my bishop is pinned because if it moves, my queen on b8 falls. And there's one more. Since his king is stuck in the center and there's an x-ray from my rook on e8 to his king on e1. So those are the themes we're going to use to hunt for the candidate moves. When I reached this position, the first question was this: which are the moves that really deserve attention here? Well, since the e-file is open, the natural idea would be to look for ways to take advantage of that. But before any plan, I always start by looking at the most direct option, which is the captures. And that's why the first move that went on the candidate list was bishop takes on a4, which at first glance looks strong, since it's a forcing move after all. But once you start calculating the whole sequence, you spot the problem, because after bishop takes on a4, the opponent has rook takes on b8. And if I keep going with bishop takes on d1, he answers rook takes on a8. And it's right after that rook takes on a8 that at the end of the day, king takes on d1 is left. So what's the result of all this? Well, even though it looks promising at first, the final position favors white because they end up a pawn up and also lock in the bishop pair, which is already enough of an advantage to steer the game toward a win. So that's why taking the knight on a4 doesn't make sense, since the calculation showed that this line only leaves an advantage for white. So I shifted my focus and started looking for moves that would open the e-file, taking advantage of the fact that the opponent's king is still stuck in the center, and that's exactly where the idea of d4 came from. Now, as always, the first thing was to check the most forcing move, which means, what if he decides to take my rook on a8? Well, in that case, I simply answer with queen takes on a8, immediately creating pressure on the rook on h1, and on top of that, taking away the opponent's chance to castle. And if he tries to escape by playing rook to g1, then the position changes completely because I follow up with bishop takes on a4 since my bishop isn't pinned anymore. And that's exactly the sequence that shows why the d4 push is so strong here. When white plays queen to f3, at first glance, it looks like a dangerous move since it creates the threat of queen takes a8. But in practice, this is a serious blunder. And this is exactly where we've got to stop and calculate carefully because this is the critical point of the position. Now, the first instinct would be to take advantage of the themes and take the knight on a4, which is hanging. But the problem shows up right after, because if I do that directly, my queen falls. So what's the way out? Well, it's to use the logic of calculation, because if the problem is my queen being at risk, I simply move the queen out of there. And by doing that, I get rid of the immediate threat. And on top of that, I start preparing to take the knight on a4, which still has no squares to run to. The most important detail of this position is pretty clear, since the knight on a4 has no squares to run to, and that's the tactical theme guiding the whole analysis. Now, when we start by studying the position, it's precisely to spot this kind of weakness, because the plan pretty much appears on its own, which is to take that knight. And with that in mind, a natural move that came up was queen to e5, which besides getting my queen out of the pin, creates a direct threat on the knight on a4. So when you calculate the opponent's options, you realize he's out of real answers because he can't play knight to c5 nor knight to b6, let alone knight to c3 or rook to a3. And in every line, the knight ends up lost. So that's why after playing queen to e5, the knight on a4 falling was unavoidable. And that was exactly the move I picked in the game. After putting my queen on e5, I started calculating the possible responses because if he tried to take on a8, I'd have rook takes on a8. And if he still insisted with bishop to a8, his problem stayed the same, since the knight on a4 was still lost. Now, in the game, he chose to play rook takes on b5, but then I answered with queen takes on b5, winning material and going up in exchange. And on top of that, the pressure stayed strong, since his king was still stuck in the center, and the knight on a4 still had no squares to escape to. So at this point, he tried to simplify with queen to c6, but I didn't go for the trades, and kept going with queen to d3, keeping the opponent's king exposed right in the middle of the board. The defense continued with bishop to f1, but then queen to b1 with check came in, followed by queen to c1, and right after that, queen to a2, and that's the moment he resigned, because the position was already beyond saving since the knight on a4 was going to fall again, and there was also the threat of rook to c8 coming in. So for white, it was a hopeless position. So here we go. Just to recap, I want you to do it like this. First, the analysis of the position where you spot the tactical themes that are there, and second, the candidate moves, because for each theme from the analysis of the position, you pick a candidate move. Then third, start calculating with the most forcing moves, which means take your candidates and start with whichever is the most forcing, following those 4 types I gave you, which are check, capture, mate threat, and threat on a piece. Only then do you calculate and remember to pay close attention both to your own moves and to your opponent's moves. So now you can take these 4 steps, which are analysis of the position, candidate moves, starting with the most forcing ones, and then calculating and try applying them on your own in your games. Now, some of you are going to manage it, but most of you are going to open the board and see a locked position like this one with the knight on a4 and go right back to playing on impulse, because knowing the method is one thing, while training it until it becomes automatic is a whole different story. That's exactly why I created Think Ahead, my complete calculation course, where I take you from the basics to advanced, step by step, from when to calculate and when not to calculate, all the way to forcing lines and the advanced techniques for finding candidate moves, with full lessons and exercises for each one until this process becomes the way you see the board. So what I showed you today is just a fraction of what's in there, and the link is in the description and in the pinned comment. All right, everybody, that's it for today, and I hope I managed to explain it in the best way possible. Now, I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's finding their way to the channel, because I'm so happy with how our community is growing. And if you're not part of it yet, take the chance to subscribe right now, and don't forget to drop a like to help strengthen our channel. So I'm going to wrap it up here, and thanks a lot, and see you in the next video.